So this session is going to be on a question that I know I've had practically since I heard the term idiopathic hypersomnia, and that is, how is idiopathic hypersomnia and narcolepsy, how are they the same, how are they different? So I'm certainly going to be listening closely to that. So our speaker is Dr. Lynn Trotti, and we are delighted to have yet another speaker from Atlanta, and showing just how rich this city is in resources, particularly for medicine and diseases and conditions. Dr. Trotti is Associate Professor of Neurology at Emory University. Her primary clinical and research interests are novel treatments for the pathophysiology of idiopathic hypersomnia, narcolepsy, and hypersomnolence. I should have rehearsed this better, sorry. Anyway, welcome to Dr. Trotti.
Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be here talking with you all today about idiopathic hypersomnia and narcolepsy. And so, without further ado, just by way of disclosures, I don't have any disclosures with industry to declare to you all. I do get, okay, sorry, my screen just changed. I do receive some funds from continuing medical education providers to give talks sort of like this. I'm also a member of the board of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. Any opinions I express, I will probably express lots of them, are my own. None of these are official statements of the board. So what we're going to do today is first just talk about what idiopathic hypersomnia is, and then really dive into, I was told to talk about idiopathic hypersomnia versus narcolepsy. I'm going to have to subdivide that into idiopathic hypersomnia, narcolepsy type 1, and narcolepsy type 2, really starting with what's different and then landing on what is the common ground, because there's so much work to be done across all of these disorders. All right, so what is idiopathic hypersomnia? So the name means you're sleepy and we don't know why. So in medicine, we really like to name things because then we feel like we've done something. So that is a really descriptive name that doesn't tell you a lot. It is one of the disorders that we call the central disorders of hypersomnolence in the sort of Bible of classification of diseases of sleep disorders. There's a group of disorders where excessive daytime sleepiness is the primary problem. Narcolepsy type 1, narcolepsy type 2, idiopathic hypersomnia all fall in that classification of disorders of excessive daytime sleepiness. And so by definition, everyone with idiopathic hypersomnia has a problem of excessive sleepiness. In people with idiopathic hypersomnia, sleep at night is either normal in length or longer than normal in length. So there are people with idiopathic hypersomnia who sleep 11, 12, 13 hours in a 24-hour period. In the sleep lab, these are people who look like, quote, good sleepers, meaning their nighttime sleep doesn't look obviously disrupted in any way. People tend to sleep a little better in the sleep lab than the average person coming into the sleep lab. Another really common part of idiopathic hypersomnia, not everybody has this, but it is very common, is just a really, really, really hard time waking up in the morning. So we call the process of going from being asleep to being awake sleep inertia. It's a short little transitional phase for people without sleep disorders who aren't sleep deprived, who are waking up in the morning. But for people with idiopathic hypersomnia, instead of taking a few minutes to sort of wake up and feel alert, it can take hours. These are people who sleep through multiple alarm clocks, who have flying alarm clocks. Really, the waking up process is very, very difficult for people with idiopathic hypersomnia. And that's true both for waking up from overnight sleep, but also waking up from naps. So people with idiopathic hypersomnia will often take very, very long naps and then wake up and feel even worse than they did before they took the nap. How do we diagnose idiopathic hypersomnia? It has some similarities to how we diagnose narcolepsy and some pretty big differences. So the multiple sleep latency test, the MSLT, the daytime nap test, Just like it's important for diagnosing narcolepsy is very important for diagnosing idiopathic hypersomnia. So one way you can objectively confirm the diagnosis of idiopathic hypersomnia is doing the multiple sleep latency test and showing that on average, people fall asleep in less than or 8 minutes across the 5 naps. That is the same time to fall asleep cutoff as in both kinds of narcolepsy. Narcolepsy type 1, narcolepsy type 2, idiopathic hypersomnia, all of those, it's an 8 minutes or less threshold to fall asleep. It means you fell asleep too quickly. That's how we mostly diagnose idiopathic hypersomnia in this country, because that's what is available to us. But because there's this group of people with idiopathic hypersomnia who sleep a lot, who sleep 11, 12, 13 hours, and because the multiple sleep latency test doesn't always detect idiopathic hypersomnia, we can also confirm an IH diagnosis by documenting that people are sleeping more than 11 hours. And we can do that in one of 2 ways. One is we can do what's called actigraphy. So that's what you're looking at the picture of on the screen, a little wrist-worn device that measures activity patterns and sort of assumes that when you're moving, you're probably awake, and when you're not moving, you're probably asleep. Many people in the room are probably wearing a consumer-grade device like this at this very moment. But we look for 11 hours of rest in a 24-hour period to diagnose idiopathic hypersomnia. Or we bring people into the sleep lab and have them spend 24 hours in the sleep lab and just sleep as much as they can, and we see if they hit that 11-hour mark. So 3 different ways that you can confirm an idiopathic hypersomnia diagnosis. And then, really importantly for our discussion today and for the diagnosis in general, we have to rule out anything else that would cause sleepiness. Idiopathic hypersomnia is too much sleepiness. We verify the sleepiness objectively, but we can't find anything else that explains it. That's that idiopathic part. And so one of the things we have to rule out is narcolepsy. By definition, you can't have both narcolepsy and idiopathic hypersomnia. You can't have cataplexy and have an idiopathic hypersomnia diagnosis. And if there's more than one REM onset on the multiple sleep latency test and the nighttime before, then it's not idiopathic hypersomnia, because then you'd be in the world of narcolepsy. So that's the key difference on the MSLT, same sleepiness timing cutoff, but in IH it's 0 or 1 episodes of REM, and in narcolepsy type 1 or type 2, it's 2 or more episodes of REM. So that is how we tell them apart. Narcolepsy was named narcolepsy when we didn't know there were 2 different kinds of narcolepsy, which is a problem now in that our terminology is a little confusing, because I think it tends to lead us to lump this way, where there's sort of narcolepsy, and we'll put type 1 and type 2 in it together, and then there's idiopathic hypersomnia, and it's totally distinct. And I think that is not a model that serves us particularly well now that we understand a little bit more about what's going on, at least in narcolepsy type 1. And so the reality is certainly messier. I think this model gets us a little closer to where we want to be, which is you could think of 3 distinct buckets: narcolepsy type 1, narcolepsy type 2, and idiopathic hypersomnia. This one isn't perfect either, as we'll see, but it's at least a little closer. So, in some ways, idiopathic hypersomnia and narcolepsy type 1 are really, although they are both disorders of excessive daytime sleepiness, are really an apples and oranges comparison. I did not make this shirt. This is from the Hypersomnia Foundation. Narcolepsy type 1 and idiopathic hypersomnia are pretty distinct in some key ways. And you'll notice I just glossed completely over narcolepsy type 2 in that statement. That was not an accident. So what do I mean when I say they're different? Well, not everybody is textbook in any of their symptoms in any disorder, but if you sort of look at the classic experience of sleepiness, the words people use to describe their sleepiness are different in people who have narcolepsy type 1 and people who have idiopathic hypersomnia. So people who have narcolepsy type 1 are more likely to experience sleepiness as an attack, a sudden falling asleep without a lot of warning. People with idiopathic hypersomnia are more likely to feel a sort of unrelenting, it's always there sleepiness, rather than sort of sudden attacks and then feeling better and then sudden attacks. And so, while many people with narcolepsy have had the experience of suddenly falling asleep somewhere where they did not mean to be falling asleep in the middle of an attack of an activity, people with idiopathic hypersomnia are much more likely to say, oh my gosh, I have got to go sleep now, leave the activity they're doing, find a bed, and fall asleep. So it's a little bit less of a sudden attack. And then you see my narcolepsy type 2 cloud in the middle. The reason narcolepsy type 2 is a cloud in the middle is some people with narcolepsy type 2 experience sort of classic narcolepsy type 1 sleepiness, and some people experience pretty classic idiopathic hypersomnia sleepiness. They are somewhere in between. And just as the daytime sleepiness differs between the disorders, the nap characteristics differ as well. So people with narcolepsy type 1, and again, these are sort of triangles because no one is, most of us are not textbook examples of anything, but sort of the classic textbook experience of a nap for somebody with narcolepsy type 1, and many people endorse this, is naps are short and they're generally refreshing. People with narcolepsy type 1 often take a nap. It's short, they wake up and they feel better. And that means we can often, as a treatment strategy, write notes to school and write notes to work and say, please let this person take a nap as part of their treatment because they'll feel better after they do it. People with idiopathic hypersomnia, even if they try to take a short nap, will end up taking a very, very long nap and will have a hard time waking up from it. And then when they do wake up, will ultimately feel worse, or at least not any better than before they took the nap. So that for somebody with idiopathic hypersomnia, it is much less useful to have a time during the day to take a nap, because having time to take a 2 to 4 hour nap is harder to work into a work day. And then my narcolepsy type 2 cloud in the middle, again, there are people with narcolepsy type 2 who fall on either end of that extreme. Nighttime sleep's really different as well. And so in people with narcolepsy type 1, although it's undeniably a problem of sleepiness, the actual duration of sleep at night is usually pretty normal. People with narcolepsy type 1 in a 24-hour period don't sleep a lot longer than the average person. Whereas in people with idiopathic hypersomnia, that is sometimes true. They sometimes sleep normal durations, but often people with idiopathic hypersomnia will, again, sleep these very, very long durations in a 24-hour period. There's a subgroup of people with narcolepsy type 2 who sleep very, very long durations as well, although many people with narcolepsy type 2 have a normal sleep duration. Fragmented nocturnal sleep, meaning a lot of awakenings, a lot of lightening of stages of sleep, a lot of shifting between different stages of sleep, is really, really common in people who have narcolepsy type 1. It is a disease in which it is very hard to have a sort of good night of sleep. In people with idiopathic hypersomnia, it's the opposite. When we look at their nighttime sleep in the sleep lab, it looks better than normal. People sleep what looks like really well, even though they still are very sleepy the next day and find sleep unrefreshing. And that very highly fragmented, broken up sleep that we see in narcolepsy type 1 is relatively uncommon in people with narcolepsy type 2. And so we really think about sort of the fundamental sleep-wake problem in narcolepsy type 1 and idiopathic hypersomnia as being different. So in narcolepsy type 1, it's a problem of state. It's a problem of flipping too much between being awake and then asleep and then awake, and in REM and then in non-REM. And there's too many transitions between states over the 24-hour period. And so in the picture, what you're looking at is sort of tracing a nighttime sleep. And as the line moves up and down, it's moving through different stages of sleep. When it's at the top, that's wake. And so somebody with narcolepsy type 1 will have a lot of awakenings typically overnight. In idiopathic hypersomnia, it's not a problem of flipping between states. It's a problem of sleeping too much for many people. And so it really is a hypersomnia, too much sleep in many cases. And again, you notice I didn't have narcolepsy type 2 on that slide. This is from a meta-analysis, so it's a study where they looked at all the studies they could find comparing nighttime sleep characteristics in people with narcolepsy type 1, type 2, and idiopathic hypersomnia, and they looked to see what's the same and what's different. And so what you're looking at in the table is how narcolepsy type 1 in that column is different or the same as idiopathic hypersomnia. And in the narcolepsy type 2 column, it's how narcolepsy type 2 is the same or different than idiopathic hypersomnia. And basically what you see is whatever your measure of disrupted sleep is, whether it's how many minutes you're awake after you first fall asleep, the sleep efficiency is the percentage of time in the sleep lab that someone is asleep. The sleep latency is the time to fall asleep. N1 is the lightest stage of sleep, and so when there is a lot of N1, it suggests there have been a lot of transitions between wake and sleep. And then an arousal is a sudden sort of startle or shifting of the speed of the brain waves, suggesting again disrupted sleep. And you see in all of those measures, the sleep of people with narcolepsy type 1 is worse than the sleep of people with idiopathic hypersomnia. And the sleep of people with narcolepsy type 2 is the same as the sleep of people with idiopathic hypersomnia. We talked about this as being a core feature of idiopathic hypersomnia. Not everybody with idiopathic hypersomnia has trouble waking up, but it is very commonly experienced. Historically, this was sometimes referred to as sleep drunkenness because people waking up with idiopathic hypersomnia had such profound impairment during the waking up period that it looked like they were drunk. I think this term is falling out of favor because it's a little blamey and problematic, but it sort of gives you a flavor of the amount of impairment. And this is really not a common symptom. It can happen to people who have narcolepsy type 1, but it's really not a common problem experienced by people with narcolepsy type 1, although quite common in idiopathic hypersomnia. Narcolepsy type 2, it's actually not been all that well studied, but certainly seems like it's more common in type 2 than in type 1. I don't need to tell a bunch of people in a room at a narcolepsy conference that REM dyscontrol features, some of the non-sleepiness symptoms of narcolepsy, can be a big part of the disease. These are things like cataplexy, sleep paralysis, and sleep-related hallucinations. It turns out those can be experienced, well, not cataplexy, so let me pause. Cataplexy, only seen in narcolepsy type 1, can't be seen in narcolepsy type 2 or idiopathic hypersomnia. But the sleep paralysis and the sleep-related hallucinations, although they are definitely most common in narcolepsy type 1, they can happen in people who have idiopathic hypersomnia as well. And so those sort of classic narcolepsy features that we think of actually sometimes happen to people who have idiopathic hypersomnia. It's just less common. And narcolepsy type 2, somewhere there in the middle. This is a great list. This is the list of FDA-approved treatments for either kind of narcolepsy. The FDA doesn't get too caught up in whether you have type 1 or type 2, which is great because that means more medicines for more people, which I'm a big fan of. And, you know, this is a nice list, and I'm not going to sort of belabor this list because that's not the point of my talk, but we have a good toolbox. Not as good as we need it to be, but we have a good toolbox of FDA-approved treatments for narcolepsy. This is the list for idiopathic hypersomnia. This used to be a blank slide. Like, until last year when I gave a talk like this, I would show the narcolepsy list and then I'd show a blank slide for IH. So yay, we have one FDA-approved drug. This matters because it's really hard to access medicines that aren't FDA approved for your specific condition because insurance will often not pay for them. That's a problem in narcolepsy too, but it is exacerbated by not having FDA approved treatments for people with idiopathic hypersomnia. And so this is another difference is although we tend to use medicines for narcolepsy to treat idiopathic hypersomnia, we are using them so-called off-label, and so access can be a problem. And then really the key and the reason why I say we should stop sort of saying there's a narcolepsy and then there's idiopathic hypersomnia, is that we understand what causes narcolepsy type 1, and although we don't know what causes the other two disorders, we know it's not the same thing. So this is from one of the very seminal early papers in narcolepsy, Dr. Mignot's work, of course, looking at measures of spinal fluid hypocretin, or orexin, and the levels that you see in people who have various disorders. And so in people who have what we now call narcolepsy type 1, narcolepsy with cataplexy, there is not hypocretin in the spinal fluid. The levels are absent or very, very, very low. That first horizontal line that you're seeing is at 110, and then there's a second line at 200. But basically, people with narcolepsy with cataplexy, now narcolepsy type 1, have a problem of hypocretin deficiency. But you know who doesn't have hypocretin deficiency? People with narcolepsy without cataplexy, or narcolepsy type 2, and people with idiopathic hypersomnia. So I won't go into all the beautiful work that's been done after this point on what we think is responsible for this in narcolepsy type 1, but we really, as a scientific community, are making huge bounds at understanding what causes narcolepsy type 1. And we don't have any idea what causes narcolepsy type 2 or idiopathic hypersomnia. We have some theories, don't get me wrong, but not anything even approaching what we understand about narcolepsy type 1. We just know that it's not the same thing. CSF hypocretin levels are normal in narcolepsy type 2 and idiopathic hypersomnia. So that's another big distinction. So, you know, I sort of alluded to maybe this is the model we should have in our heads. Maybe. One of the studies that came out a number of years ago that sort of changed my thinking on this was this study I'm going to walk you through here, where it's something called the cluster analysis, where you feed the computer a bunch of symptoms or a bunch of characteristics. In this case, they fed the computer characteristics of people's naps and their MSLT results, their daytime nap test results. And then it says, okay, computer, go figure out who's most like each other and who's different. Sort of make groups of people. And what we would like to see when we do a cluster analysis is that the groups the computer comes up with line up with our diagnostic groups, because that means we're diagnosing things the right way. Well, sadly, that's not what happened. So what happened was there was one really clear cluster of people with narcolepsy with cataplexy, narcolepsy type 1. Their symptoms, the computer could recognize it and put them all together. And then there was one group that the computer put together that was people who had idiopathic hypersomnia, who were also people who were habitually sleeping at least 10 hours a night. It sort of didn't have any trouble separating that out as its own disease group. And then there was this messy group in the middle, which is the people who had narcolepsy type 2 and idiopathic hypersomnia who didn't sleep a long time. And the computer lumped them all together because it couldn't tell the difference. So I think that suggests that idiopathic hypersomnia and narcolepsy type 2 may be more similar than their names would suggest. Part of the problem for that might be the way that we are diagnosing these disorders. So the multiple sleep latency test, the daytime nap test, is really important for our diagnosis of these disorders, and it's really good for people with narcolepsy type 1. It usually matches up with the diagnosis we're expecting. If you do it again, you're going to get the same answer. That is not as true for people with idiopathic hypersomnia and people with narcolepsy type 2. A number of groups have looked at if you do the MSLT twice, and these are in clinical situations where people are still sleepy, but they decided to repeat it because it didn't sort of make sense, the diagnosis changes about half the time. And so people could start with idiopathic hypersomnia and then have another test and now have narcolepsy type 2, or vice versa. So some of the overlap we're seeing might be that our test is not sort of letting us group people. So I think for now, until we understand idiopathic hypersomnia and narcolepsy type 2, as well as we understand narcolepsy type 1, Our reality is kind of messy, and we just have to live with that, which is that we have these sort of 3 diagnostic buckets, which is how we label people in healthcare. But really, probably some of the people that we're calling narcolepsy type 2 really do have narcolepsy type 1, because if you don't have cataplexy, but your hypocretin is low, you have narcolepsy type 1, but we don't test most people's hypocretin. And so there's probably some people that don't have cataplexy, so we think they have narcolepsy type 2, but we have the wrong diagnosis because we didn't look for narcolepsy type 1. And then there's probably this important distinction between idiopathic hypersomnia, people who sleep a really long time, and people who sleep a normal amount. And then some of the narcolepsy type 2 people look like one of those idiopathic hypersomnias, and some of the narcolepsy type 2 people look at like the other idiopathic hypersomnia. And then if we do the test again, people can move across all of those buckets. And so it's a little messy. We're working on it. But if you're, encountering some of these things and saying, why are those 2 things so similar, or why are those 2 things so different? Some of it has to do with some of these uncertainties here. And then I want to just round out with some common features. So I've talked about sleepiness. I talked a little bit about REM dyscontrol features. I talked about napping and nighttime sleep. It's really common for people with all 3 of these disorders to have some other core symptoms that are not part of the diagnostic criteria, but really, really contribute to making it hard to live with these diseases. And those are things like brain fog and cognitive dysfunction and fatigue. And people with all 3 of these diagnoses have those all quite commonly. I don't think we talk about this enough in healthcare, but I think another thing that makes it really hard to live with these disorders is the lack of understanding, the sort of stigma. I think everybody on the planet has been sleepy, but not everybody on the planet has been narcolepsy or hypersomnia sleepy. And so there tends to be a lot of, I, again, don't need to tell people in this room this, there tends to be a lot of like, we'll just have some coffee, shake it off, stop being lazy. Like there's this really toxic messaging, sometimes from loved ones and sometimes internally. As much as that is a problem in narcolepsy, that is absolutely a problem in idiopathic hypersomnia. That is a problem we all need to work to fix. Because again, I think they make these disorders a lot harder to live with. Safety is a concern across all 3 of these disorders. So driving in particular is a high-risk activity, and it is a high-risk activity if you are sleepy. And so I'm showing you actually road signs from my home country where they are reminding people every few miles to maybe pull over and take a nap. But also some data from a study looking at, with all 3 disorders, how likely people were to have a history of car accidents in the last 5 years. And I think, unsurprisingly, people with all 3 of these disorders are at a higher risk of accidents. The good news is we have treatments. The good news is that treatment improves driving safety. The bad news is treatment probably does not normalize this risk. And so this was a controlled study. It included people with narcolepsy and idiopathic hypersomnia, where they had people drive on the road and looked at how often the car was swerving. And untreated, people with excessive sleepiness did worse than controls. But even when they were treated, in this case with modafinil, it definitely helped, but it did not normalize driving performance. And so across these disorders, we really have to think about safety. And even when people are on treatment, we need to think about safety. And again, probably not something that is news to people in this room, but just as work and relationships are affected by narcolepsy, work and relationships are affected by idiopathic hypersomnia, and can be a major problem. And so things like the ending of a relationship because of sleepiness, or a major change in job status because of sleepiness is really common across, unfortunately, really common across all 3 disorders. I'm an adult neurologist, so sometimes I forget about the kids, but school and social functioning are, of course, also impacted for kids with all three of these disorders in terms of grades and missed school and quality of life and participation in after-school activities, and sort of every aspect of childhood life is impacted by all three disorders. And so, unsurprisingly, if you look at quality of life, there are lots of ways we sort of subdivide quality of life from a medical standpoint, because we like to measure things. But across many of these different ways of looking at quality of life, all three disorders cause pretty similar impairments in quality of life. And then finally, although I said we have a great list of treatments for narcolepsy that are FDA approved, we're not where we need to be with any of these disorders, right? We need more options. We need better options. We need medicines that, really resolve the safety issues so people are fully safe. We really, on current treatments, quality of life often does not get to normal, and it should be great if we get a lot closer to that. Most of our trials don't even ask about things like brain fog or cognitive performance or fatigue, even though those are major parts of the disorders. And sometimes our medicines don't do a great job of addressing those either. Even sleepiness itself, for many people, is not fully normalized on treatment. Some people on treatments for a long time develop tolerance, and then they have to try something else. Of course, medication side effects and drug interactions are a problem, and then access and cost are a huge problem. And so this is true for narcolepsy, and this is absolutely true for idiopathic hypersomnia as well. And so certainly a lot of work to be done, and I think there's enough in common across these three disorders that teamwork is important in that regard. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. I have a question to begin on. We've had quite a lot of discussion this weekend about misdiagnoses and the fact that the medical professional you go to may not know enough about narcolepsy to really get you to the right place quickly enough or get the diagnosis quickly enough. And I can only imagine that adding idiopathic into that only complicates things. Can you talk about that and how you feel that awareness is there, even perhaps in the sleep medical community? There may not be enough of it, and what is it that people who have sleep issues who eventually come to a professional about it can do to maybe make sure that they're winding up in the right place with somebody that considers whether it is in fact idiopathic and not narcolepsy?
Yeah, thank you. That is a great question. So you're right. There's an unacceptably long diagnostic delay for narcolepsy in general. It takes a long time to get in the right door in many cases. And although we have good numbers for narcolepsy, the numbers on diagnostic delay for idiopathic hypersomnia, we don't sort of have an apples to apples comparison, but I think you are right. It's probably even worse because at least most people's primary care doctors have heard of narcolepsy. There's lots of doctors who have literally never heard the words idiopathic hypersomnia, and so then it's really hard to sort of get people into the right door. I think the other thing that makes it a little harder to diagnose idiopathic hypersomnia is you have to sort of rule out so many other things that, like, part of the diagnosis potentially is like, well, maybe they're depressed, and you sort of go down a lot of dead ends in the pursuit of ruling things out, and so I think that's a problem. I'm sensitive to sort of putting the responsibility for fixing that problem onto people who have these disorders, but I do think that better awareness is good for everybody. I think for people who it took a long time to get diagnosed, if they can circle back with their physicians and say things like, hey, you sent me to a sleep doctor and it changed my life because I got on treatment, right? Like to at least sort of one-on-one with the doctors that people have access to. Obviously, we need system-wide education as well, but to your question specifically about what can individuals do, I think is sort of spread the word through their own networks. Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering what the data is on how effective Xywav is for treating idiopathic hypersomnia.
Yeah, so Xywav or lower sodium oxybate is the one drug that was on my list that's FDA approved for idiopathic hypersomnia. This is the lower sodium version of Xyrem, which people may also be familiar with if they're not familiar with Xywav. They did a study of over 100 people, and they put everybody on Xywav, and then after everybody got to the right dose and sort of got stable on it for a few months, they kept half of people on it, and then they put half of people on placebo. So it was a little bit of an unusual study design, but what they found was that it helps with sleepiness about as much as oxybates help with sleepiness in narcolepsy. It was not a direct comparison, but it seems to help with sleepiness. They also found for idiopathic hypersomnia, it helped with people's sleep inertia, that difficulty waking up in the morning. It helped with people's work performance, at least on a questionnaire level. And so again, it's not a head-to-head in the same study with narcolepsy, but it was a helpful medication of a similar magnitude of benefit. Hi. Oh, I didn't even know there was another microphone. I'm being pointed here.
Didn't mean to preempt there, Dr. Mignot. Can you address any data or information about circadian rhythms and how they might interact with type 1, type 2, and idiopathic hypersomnia, delayed sleep phase or advanced sleep phase?
Yeah, so part of what we are doing when we're diagnosing idiopathic hypersomnia and narcolepsy type 2, for that matter, is ruling out other things that can cause sleepiness. And so for people who have a circadian rhythm disorder, where their underlying rhythm of day and night is shifted, so an example, you brought up delayed sleep-wake phase disorder. This is a disorder where instead of, say, getting sleepy at 10 and sleeping from 10 until 6, somebody with a delayed sleep-wake phase disorder wouldn't even get sleepy until, say, 2 or 3 in the morning. And then if you're sleepy and falling asleep at 2 or 3 in the morning, then you need to sleep quite a bit later, but often people cannot sleep quite a bit later because work starts at 8. And so people with delayed sleep-wake phase disorder tend to get sleep deprived because they're trying to live in a world that is not aligned with their rhythm. And so if that's the problem, we don't want to make a narcolepsy type 2 diagnosis, we don't want to make an idiopathic hypersomnia diagnosis, we want to help people get the sleep that they need. But where it gets a little more complicated is that some people, and it's been looked at a little bit in idiopathic hypersomnia, some people with idiopathic hypersomnia tend to be sort of night owls. So they might get the sleep that they need. They're not sleep deprived, but they're sort of shifted later. And so there is some interest and some work being done that's very preliminary in what is going on with the circadian rhythm in idiopathic hypersomnia, and is that part of the reason for why sometimes people sleep long and why sometimes people have a lot of trouble waking up? Dr. Mignot.
Yeah, thanks for your great presentation. I think we all agree that there's this blurry kind of, and so what do you think we should do in terms of moving to the next step, in the sense that I know it's we have diagnosed the problem and we need to do something about it, and I saw that you're on the ASM board of directors. So I was just thinking, what do you think we should do, and at what speed, etc.? I mean, it's very difficult to change diagnosis for people, but at the same time, you know, we just don't want to create something that's wrong.
Right.
So I was just wondering what if you have an opinion, and I'm not going to held you accountable to the board of directors. If you say your opinion, you don't have to necessarily, yes.
So it's, I mean, it's obviously an important question. I think the tension underlying the question is, I think what would be best for the science and what would be best for the most amount of people right now are different, and they are in tension with each other. And what I mean by that is, I think from a scientific perspective, we probably want narcolepsy type 1 to be narcolepsy and everything else to be something else. And we probably want that to be as finely grained into as many buckets as possible, right? It probably really does matter if you're a long sleeper or you're not a long sleeper. And it probably matters if you have sleep inertia or you don't have sleep inertia. And so I think we need one narcolepsy bucket and then lots of buckets named something else with as much granularity as possible, so that when we are doing mechanistic studies, when we're doing trials, we can really be sure that the groups that we are studying are mostly people who have the same thing.
Yeah.
But the FDA approves medicines for narcolepsy. So drug companies pay for medicines for narcolepsy. So what we should do for patients is call idiopathic hypersomnia narcolepsy type 3. Right?
Yeah.
And then get a bunch of people access to treatment. And so I think, and even if we don't call it narcolepsy type 3, we don't want to take away narcolepsy from narcolepsy type 2, because then we will take away medications from people who need them. And so that's what I mean, is that there's this terrible tension between getting people access to medicines in the world that we live in and trying to do the science. So I think the best we can do for now is do the science on the subgroups that we can and hope to change the criteria once we have a little bit more data in which to do that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, of course, because you're very smart. And not to say...
I'm going to be quoting that for the rest of my life. Thank you, Dr. Mignot.
But I was wondering if you think we could talk to the insurance company, maybe like the SM or someone should... Because after all, I'm so tired of being dictated by insurance company, which we should do. I think it's a lot of doctors feel this way, but maybe it's because we don't really engage well with them. And I don't know if there is a forum where we can really engage with them and explain that's a problem. And I don't think they are fundamentally evil. I think they are not competent or whatever. I mean, they just don't understand everything because it's so complicated. Right. And I'm just wondering, I mean, the SM could be one of the way, I have no idea, or the FDA, but maybe we should, because I'm sure it's not the only place in medicine where they have this kind of problem.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's both, right? Like the AASM can do what the AASM can do, but yes, I think at the level of the FDA, we need more advocacy. You know, I think part of why the AASM puts out clinical practice guidelines is to help. Yes. These are documents saying, here's the best evidence, here's what medicines we think people should use for treating various disorders. Part of that is to guide physicians, right? But part of that is to nudge insurance companies so that you can go back to the insurance company and say, well, no, actually the AASM recommends that we use this. It's still limited by the available evidence, and so we can't say as much as we would like. The AASM has started coming up with scorecards where they look at payer policies and how well they align with evidence-based recommendations to try to then push insurance companies to change their policies. They started with sleep apnea, and now they're moving to insomnia, but like eventually we'll get to the rarer diseases.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay, we're at time. Thank you so much, Dr. Trotti, for a wonderful explanation. Even though it is really complicated, we understand that. It's not straight and clear, but obviously there's a lot of work underway to try to make these distinctions better. So thank you so much for the presentation.